So you're still there. Fantastic. Thank you for staying with us. Listen, before you get stuck into your plans for lunch, we have got a pensions special for you. And I'm joined by none other than John Lawson from Aviva and Sir Steve Webb from Royal London, no less. Now then, gents, we're going to get stuck into all things pensions regulation here. We are usually inundated with questions from advisors. And I've got one question that's come in directly from a chap called Ken Davey. Yeah. It says, in the budget, Philip Hammond has left high rate tax relief untouched, which came as a surprise to a great many of us, certainly to Ken apparently. In essence, this means you can still put £40,000 away if you're a high rate taxpayer and get full tax relief. Firstly, Ken wants to know, did this surprise you? And secondly, do you see it continuing?
So, does it surprise me? Probably not. A couple of reasons for that. Firstly, there's a lot of pressure from backbench MPs in the Conservative Party to maintain tax relief for what is essentially their core voter, and therefore, they'd be shooting themselves in their foot if they did something large and structural like that. The second reason is Brexit. Brexit is going to take up a lot of government time. The civil servants are, or certainly the senior civil servants are all being dragged towards Brexit. So I don't really see in the short term any major move on tax relief. We talked about it last year. Remember, there was a big report that George Osborne commissioned, and he decided not to do anything. We favoured, a £2 for £1 system, essentially 33% flat rate for everyone at that time. But I don't think that's going to see the light of day anytime soon. Certainly not within the next 3 or 4 years. Okay,
interesting. John mentions that they wouldn't have done that because they might have shot themselves in the foot. Did they shoot themselves in the other foot?
Are you thinking of the self-employed by any chance? Yeah. Just on the point about higher rate relief, I guess the first thing is worth bearing in mind this is a year of 2 budgets, so it's only half time. Yep. And so whilst I would agree with John, I think a wholesale flat rate relief, it takes a hefty amount off some, Daily Mail readers and indeed Daily Mail journalists, which is pretty significant. And the gainers don't thank you. Because if you redistribute, they get a few quid and they probably don't know what tax relief is or how it affects them because it's all done through the pay packet or whatever. So I think that the politics of some big structural reform like that don't work. But what I think we will see is more nudging towards ISA and away from pension. So, for example, you mentioned the 40,000 limit, and obviously that's been tapered for high earners anyway. But now there's a 20,000 ISA limit coming down the track. You could imagine him standing up and saying in the autumn, well, do you need to put 60,000 per person into savings? So you could see more salami slicing, more of that, I would guess. But on the self-employed, that was a funny one because you got Matthew Taylor's been sent away to do a report on what is this thing called self-employment, the gig economy, incorporation, what do we do about it? And he kind of jumped the gun. And they talk about 145 million, which is the net effect of the Class 2 abolition, which has already been announced and banked, and the Class 4 increase. So it's a slightly dodgy number. It's more than that if you did a U-turn on Class 4. But it sort of preempts the Matthew Taylor report, and what they've done now is backed off and said, right, well, we'll wait till the summer, we'll wait till we know what we're going to do with self-employed, but then we'll come back to you with legislation in the autumn. And I think just doing it in isolation, just jacking up the self-employed contributions was a mistake. There's a good case for the self-employed putting more in and turning that into pension, and perhaps that's something we'll come on to.
I would argue probably the self-employed should have been paying more anyway, because the changes you put through, Steve, to extend the state pension, previously self-employed only qualified for the basic state pension, and now they qualify for the single state pension, which is a roll-up of the basic state pension and the additional state pension, what was SERPs and state second pension. So they qualify for that overnight, so effectively a £30, £40 increase in their pension per week overnight. If you sat and worked out how much that might cost, something like £60,000, £70,000 worth of pension, which the self-employed gained overnight without paying any more tax for it. So there's potentially a justification there in raising national insurance for the self-employed to cover that additional cost.
Can you envisage a busy day in the summer where there's lots going on, there's a heavy news day and this gets parked in the long grass at some point?
Well, it is still, although in the grand scheme of hundreds of billions of pounds of government spending and revenues, 700 million or whatever the figure was for Class 4 doesn't sound that great, but it's still, it's still serious money. So I think they will try and find an elegant climb down. My guess is they'll try and match the increased contribution with some sort of increased benefit, maybe access to better maternity pay or sick pay of some sort. But what I'd like to see is, this is kind of an idea that we floated last year in a Royal London policy paper, the idea that you use Class 4 as a way of getting the self-employed into pensions. Because we know that roughly 1 in 7 self-employed put money into a pension last year, and it's falling. And it's worse for women, it's worse for the low paid. It's a real issue. So why not, make a virtue out of the mess they're in and say, okay, we will put the rate up, but you can divert that money into a pension with your name on it. And that way, it's still their money. We've got 2 million self-employed people who pay class 4, started saving. Let's make a virtue of it.
Okay. Jane Hodges is back in touch. Jane's been sending us a question in each session so far. Fantastic, Jane. Well done. She says, in her opinion, pensions freedom is the best thing that's ever happened to pensions, along with single flat rate pension, but they're both so misunderstood and cause such angst with lower paid, who think that national insurance contribution equals the right to state pension. Should the industry do more to educate and explain?
Yeah, I think the industry definitely does need to do more. I think prior to freedom and choice, people had limited choice, to be quite honest. If you had less than roughly £50,000, you really had to buy an annuity. You didn't really have a lot of choice because there was no market for drawdown underneath that. Now people have got tons of choice. They can take it as cash, they can buy drawdown, lots of things they can do with smaller amounts. Probably the worrying thing for me for people with smaller pots is a lot of 55 to 60-year-olds are taking that as cash. They're not going to get the state pension for another 12, 15 years, and taking it as cash doesn't allow it to grow. It would become something useful, at age 67 or 68, whenever the state pension might be, but they're taking it out at age 55. Sometimes that might be sensible to pay high interest debt, for example, but I think most people are just using it to have a holiday or buy a car or something. It's readily available money, and that's a bit of a worry for me. So I think we do need to educate people. Certainly we've spent a huge amount of time and effort educating Aviva customers over the last year about the freedom and choice changes, what it all means, the tax losses they can suffer if they take their money back out, and when it might be sensible to take money out and for example, repay debt. So yeah, a big education job, and we're only partway through it.
What could that education be, though? I assume you agree that more education is better on this topic, but...
Yeah, I mean, on the state pension side of things, actually there is access to information in a rather better way than in the past. So in the past you had to fill in a form and wait several weeks. Now, as long as you can battle through the government's ID verification process, which once you've done once is okay, you can then almost instantaneously see a pretty good guide to what you've got on new state pension, what you will get if you keep working, and that's being improved all the time. So that's a big step forward. And although, as Jane, who put the question in, said, we are in this transitional period, it's not instantaneously flat rate and simple. Even by the end of this Parliament, the majority of new pensioners will get the flat rate or better. So it'll take a little while, but people ultimately, my kids are in their 20s, they know that when they retire, to the extent they think about any of this stuff, it's a flat pension, it's £8,000 a year for 35 years, and then they're on their own. If they want to retire on more than £8,000 a year, they have to do something about it.
Okay. And are we fighting a perpetual battle against a demographic time bomb here that we can't win?
I think the state pension age has certainly been too slow to rise. If you look at the life expectancy for men's increasing by about 1 year every 5 years that go by, 2 years every 10, and women just slightly behind that. And the state pension hasn't been keeping pace. So there is, to that extent, a bit of a demographic time bomb. Certainly people are going to have to work later. Politically, I think politicians that are not keen to take that message out. It's not a politically popular message to increase state pension age. I think probably in the UK, people are much more accepting of that than they have been, let's say, in Europe. Particularly the French, are not particularly accepting of rises to their pension age. So there is a bit of a demographic time bomb, but I think we need to get the realism across to people that you're living much longer. You certainly can't afford to spend 30 or 40 years in retirement because you just simply won't have enough money. So we need to get that balance point right, between working life and retired life, and rather than look at 65 as a fixed figure, that's going to change as time goes on, as people live longer and longer.
And I was going to say that one of the cultural shifts that's going to happen next year is, for the first time, men and women won't have a state pension age of exactly 65. Yep. So from October 2018, that magic, as John says, 65, that's sort of so etched in the psyche that that's when you retire for a man. Nobody will have a state pension age of 65 beyond autumn 2018. And suddenly everyone will realise, well, We'll ask why, we'll want to know what's changing, we'll realise that it's going up. And we've been in a catch-up phase. I think John's absolutely right. I mean, funnily enough, there was a demo on budget day outside Parliament about state pension age rises because of the catching up that's been done, because the problem the last government encountered was that male state pension age hadn't changed for a century. And it just, we had to catch up and then take things on. And the challenge now, and John Cridland will be publishing his report later this month to the government, is to get that balance right between being realistic about pension ages, but thinking about the people who are never going to work into their late 60s. And can we do more to enable them, for example, to change careers? So rather than being burnt out at 51 doing heavy manual work and then just drawing sickness benefits, which is miserable for everybody, think about enabling people to retrain, think about much earlier in their life doing new jobs that they can do later in life.
Yeah, I think to be fair to younger generations, as Philip Hammond was talking about that last week at the budget about not passing huge debts on to our children, and the same is true. We shouldn't pass on these huge liabilities in terms of pensions to our children as well. You can't saddle one generation with a huge debt and a huge liability to pay these pensions to people who are effectively drawing that pension too young. So I think that balance has to be fair. Otherwise, that intergenerational contract breaks down, and the younger people say, well, I never, why am I paying huge taxes to support this? I never agreed to this.
Given that politicians sometimes have a fairly short-termist view about as far out as the next election cycle, is there a contradiction there with the political capital and power of the baby boomer generation and the extent to which there's a preponderance of assets there is a preponderance of pension wealth there, and also a vast swathe of voters there as well? Is this a structural problem that takes a bit of bravery to break away from?
Well, it does take bravery, but funnily enough, there was a lot that happened, I keep harking back to the last Parliament, but things like public service pensions that you often say, outrageous, bastion of DB, it's all terribly unaffordable. The last Parliament essentially said to public service workers, right, you've got to put more in, you've got to work for longer, and you're going to get less out. And all of the savings from all of those changes won't accrue for at least 10 years. So there was all the political flack, all the grief, and none of the immediate benefit. Likewise, with the new state pension, that's going to mature over a period of decades. The state pension age increases. Actually, quite a lot of political flack, possibly why I'm sitting here, quite a lot of political flack was taken in the last Parliament for the long term because something had to be done, as John says.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, yeah. The last Parliament was, particularly forward-thinking, and that probably broke with tradition in terms of pension policy that was always short-term before. I think, Steve's right that the last term did take on some long-term issues, and really they had to.
Matt Katech has been in touch again. He asks, the general public has no idea what the true cost of the state pension is. What is it and why is it not conveyed to the public who say they've paid their tax? They should be able to check to exactly what they've paid in comparison. Is that a fair shout, do you think, that it's a bit opaque still, the state pension?
I think it is. Steve's talking about the fact it's available online, and it is available online. I stumbled across it though, when I was doing my self-assessment return, that, I can get my state pension online. We need to tell people that it's there. So we need to tell people, one, they can get it online, because that's the foundation for your retirement for most people. It makes up, still today about 45% of retirement income for the newly retired. So we should be having a big campaign to say it's online now, you can go and get this. This is the foundation, the start of your financial planning. And we all have these systems which enable people to model the retirement planning. So I think that's the first big thing we've got to do. But I think telling people about the cost of it is also important, because state pension, to buy that today would probably cost 300,000 or somewhere near that mark. It's a fairly expensive thing to buy, and I don't think people realise, just how valuable it is. When we talk about the self-employed increase, which is, on its own was worth, 60, 70,000 for the self-employed. I don't think people really understand how much that's worth, and I think it would be helpful if people did understand, in those terms.
Opaque, or is there any more to be done in this area?
It's a lot less opaque than it was, in the sense that what you get out of the sausage machine is now an awful lot clearer. Ultimately will be flat rate. But it is redistributive. It isn't like a private pension with your name on it and your contributions go in a pot and what you get out is proportionate to what you put in. It is specifically to try and get pretty much everybody to that baseline level. Yeah. So a high earner will put more in than they get out. And, you know, I think we should be honest about that, but I actually think that, in a sense, that is the role of the state. You've got a set of people who will not get decent private provision. Maybe they're, you know, carers or low paid or you know, sick or disabled. There needs to be that foundation. That's what the national insurance system is doing. But we also need people to realise how limited it is, because although it's a valuable benefit, it is 8,000 quid when you retire. And if you're on 25, 26,000, you're not going to want to live on 8,000 when you retire.
Yeah. John Phillips has been in touch. He says, speaking as a 62-year-old, John, you don't look a day over 40. There's a finite amount of time a person can be productive in work. Why should we work to age 70 plus? How about taking profit from business and going back to company-sponsored retirement schemes finishing after 40 years on maybe 50% of income? Is that even feasible, given the way the world's moved?
I don't think so with life expectancy moving as fast as it is. I think we need to be really realistic about retirement ages. I think probably the key is to save, to get people into saving as young as possible. We have them in auto-enrollment from age 22 now, and I think that over the long term, that policy will drive a step change long term, that people will have sufficient funds. Unfortunately, there's the generations in the middle, particularly Generation X. People in their 40s at the moment who are probably the least well saved generation. The baby boomers are reasonably well saved, although it's patchy across the baby boomers. And only about half of them, are well saved, and the other half are pretty badly saved. So, I think when it comes to retiring early, I think it always comes back to the same chestnut. Have you saved enough? If you've saved a lot from an early age, you can afford to go early. If you've not, you can't.
Okay.
And what's striking to me is if you look at working rates amongst older workers at the moment, although they've been rising quite sharply, we're still not back at the level we were back at the start of the 1970s. So, 40 odd years ago, when frankly on average health was worse, more people smoked, more people did heavy manual jobs, there was more manufacturing, we had more people working longer then than we do today. So that suggests to me there is very considerable untapped potential for the right sort of work, for the right sort of people, and that's the challenge.
Yeah, a lot of older people are choosing to go back and do their own thing. Yeah. This huge growth in the number of self-employed has been particularly driven by older ages, and it's people. I always want to set up that wee business and do this and do that, rather than what I've been doing all my life. It's people doing what they want to do. So I wouldn't write people off at 62. People are perfectly useful. At 70 and way beyond, as we can see. It just you need to do the right thing for you.
Okay. I've got a question here about how do you feel about the WASPy campaign? And do you think anything could be done about those women who did not receive direct communication with the most recent change in retirement age, who feel a sense of betrayal as the change to 65, legislated for in the 90s, doesn't seem to have sunk in?
And I think anybody would sympathise with someone who simply didn't know and found out at very short notice there was going to be a very large increase in the pension age. Nobody could fail to sympathise with that. As you say, the main legislation that drove the increase was passed, 20 odd years ago. And had that legislation been fully communicated, it was good legislation. It gave people at least 15 years notice before anything changed, 25 years notice before it was fully in, and all it did was treated men and women the same gradually. And the evidence is that, the DWP did survey back in the early 2000s that said the majority of that cohort we're talking about knew something was going on. Yeah. So we aren't talking about everybody, and that's why across-the-board solutions to this would be really very difficult, because an awful lot of people did know and accommodated it. And I've always felt that if the campaigners could find individual people who were really adversely affected by not being told, could take a case to an ombudsman and say, DWP knew in the early 2000s that a minority of people didn't know, and then didn't act on that, that's always felt to me their strongest case. And then perhaps some sort of very targeted redress for those who'd suffered from maladministration, but I don't think any blanket solution is feasible, really.
I think one of the key problems is that the public are not hugely interested in pensions. When we mail our educational material, we were talking earlier about educating customers, we have educational material, and we typically get something like a 5 or 6% readership rate, which is fantastic in our industry, but it's still only 5 or 6%. Look at the other way around, over 90% are not reading it. Yeah. So we do stuff on state pension. So it's all been there, and it's been there for people to read. It's just they've not read it. And I think if we learn a lesson from communication, we need to get out there and do it again and again and again and again, and really bring it into the national psyche. You know, make it part of national, you know, cultural and part of TV and TV shows and so on. You know, people need to see that all the time and say, well, that's what's happening. You know, state pension age is going up. I need to do something about that or think about that.
Yeah, it's not the first thing that you think of of an evening when you sit down after a day's work, is it?
No, definitely
not. What impact do you think lifetime ISAs will have on auto-enrolment, and has this been a political own goal, asks Guy Skinner?
I think, you know, I have a fear that again, people see this new shiny toy and opt out their pension scheme and lose essentially a 3% minimum employer contribution, and in many cases a lot more than 3%. So for me, that's a big danger. I don't think lifetime ISA in itself is necessarily a bad thing. It can be useful, I think, for young people that are saving up for their first home. It can be useful, I think, for self-employed people as an alternative. You know, certainly basic rate tax-paying self-employed people as an alternative to pension. But for people who are in employment, I don't really see it as the mainstay. I would see company pensions, workplace pensions as a mainstay. For people who are in employment, yes, they could use lifetime ISA as a top-up. But that's my big fear, is that you know, some people begin to opt out of their workplace pension to invest in the ISA because they can't afford to do both. And that for me is a danger. And I think the government needs to be, you know, a lot more noisy about that risk at the moment. They've not said an awful lot about this publicly because, you know, they want to present LISA as a success. But, you know, I think it needs to be a responsible success, not just, you know, a new toy.
Steve, if you were a financial advisor, would you be wary of the lifetime ISA?
I would, particularly for somebody who has access to a workplace pension with a generous employer contribution, because, you know, you can put your pound in the office, and if the employer will match that, suddenly you've doubled your money. And even with the generous tax treatment of LISA, you're not going to get that kind of thing. I think the other big worry I have for LISAs, not so much for people who are advised, to be frank, but for the general public, is the preponderance of cash ISAs. You know, we know a lot of money goes into cash ISAs. We know the majority of young people put their money in cash ISAs. If you're saving for a deposit, instinctively that might well be what you do, because you think, well, I've got this target, I'll be able to see where I don't want this to go up or down. But then potentially you've opted out at workplace pension, lost an employer contribution and the tax relief on that. You're getting negative real returns, almost certainly. The LISA is going to be an expensive product for providers to administer with all the, well, that's your part, that's the government top-up part. You've got to test whether when they take the money out, it's gone on the right sort of property, all that stuff. So the returns are going to be poor, negative real returns, probably for a decade, because your average first-time buyer is in their early 30s. So what do? Repeatedly opt out of auto-enrolment pension, put your money in a negative real return asset, and then wonder why you're not getting the best outcome.
Yeah. Colin Braceland's been in touch. He wants to know if you think that the government providing guidance, although helpful to some people, can confuse those who clearly need advice. I think he leads us on to a bigger topic around how to bridge this gap in the pensions market.
Yeah, I think maybe Farmer, as Ricky mentioned in the previous session, is good at delineating what advice is. You know, advice will be a personal recommendation in the future, and I don't think the government's helped in, you know, particularly the Money Advice Service calling that advice, because it's not advice. You know, it's delivered by people who are not qualified. You don't have the same recourse to the Financial Ombudsman or the Financial Services Compensation Scheme. So I think it's important when we move beyond the current definition and move to the new definition of advice, that the difference between advice and guidance is clearly delineated, and that guidance can't call itself advice. You know, I think that's incredibly important. Advice is delivered by qualified people. They've got, you know, the customer's got recourse to the Financial Ombudsman, Financial Services Compensation Scheme. Yes, they pay money for that, but, you know, they're getting a service from a qualified person. Guidance, on the other hand, you know, should show its badges as well. It's delivered by someone who doesn't need to be qualified at any level. You know, it is free, and it's probably done on a best endeavours basis, and you've not got recourse to any compensation if it goes wrong.
But to a certain extent, is it not potato, potato, tomato, tomato? Should we call it all off? Because as a consumer guidance advice, they're not making those distinctions, are they?
No, I mean, consumers certainly don't make that distinction. You know, we have the Citizens Advice Bureau, Money Advice Service, neither of which are offering what we would think of as advice. I think pension-wise has been a good thing, in the sense that you did need somewhere for people to go where they could just get basic factual information that wasn't advice, but just explain some of the options. And, you know, the pensions advisory service who sat behind PensionWise on the phones were advertising for people with 10 years pensions knowledge. So, you know, on that service, I think on the whole, you're getting a good quality service. The feedback's good. They've had a couple of million website hits. It's not a substitute for personalised financial advice for those who need it, but that absolutely had to be something to fill that gap for those who either didn't or couldn't access advice.
Okay. Stuart Lockhart wants to know how long the government can continue the final salary scheme for government workers.
Well, they've got something like a 25-year deal was struck just 5 years ago, so we would expect that to hold good for another 20 years. And as Steve mentioned, retirement ages went up by 5 years. The accrual rate came down a bit, and the public sector workers were asked to contribute more. In fact, you know, if you look in some higher earning public sector workers are contributing quite a lot now. You know, maybe 15% of pay as a personal contribution, and that's, you know, the employer contribution on top of that. So there's some significant contributions, plus you've got things, you know, for higher earning public sector workers, typically in the National Health Service, you've got things like the lifetime allowance, coupled with those high contribution rates, are persuading a lot of them to opt out. You know, they can't transfer, obviously, you know, like people in the private sector, because that's been banned in the public sector now. You know, but you know, if you come out of that scheme, you can see your accrued pension increasing in line with inflation once you've left, and you think, well, if I stay in, what is my pension going to go up much faster than that? You know, I'm going to have to pay 15% of that. More of it will be taxable. Can I be bothered? So more of them are coming out. So that will make it more affordable as well. So I think it's certainly more affordable than it has been in the past, without a doubt. It will need to continue to evolve, though. You know, 65 will become increasingly redundant for public sector workers, as it's become redundant for the state pension. Yeah. And I think long before that I didn't, you know, the 20 years is out that we've still got to go on that deal. I think we'll have to have another discussion about what a realistic retirement age, affordable retirement age, is for the taxpayer, because they're the ones that are paying those pensions.
You think they'll be happy just to park this further down the road for 20 years?
Well, I mean, the big changes that have already been made, so it's no longer final salary across the public sector, it's career average, which is fairer in my view. The pension age, as John says, raised to 65 and then linked pretty much to state pension age. So we already know state pension age is going to hit 67, 68. So, you know, a few years ago, a nurse starting in nursing would have got a pension of 60. Now she'll get it at 68, 69, something like that. So that's actually, you know, she lost a quarter or a third of her pension. These are huge changes. I think the one thing that I would add about all of this is I often get a newspaper ring me up wanting an outraged comment about, let's say, nurses' pensions. And they say, this is a disgrace, you know, why don't you shut the scheme? But what do you replace it with? If you replace it with a funded scheme, a DC funded scheme, you've still got all of today's retired nurses. And at the moment, their pensions are being paid by today's workers and their employers. That's still going to happen. But if today's nurses are putting money into a pot with their own name on for their own pension, where's the money coming from for today's retired? And the answer is tax. So if you want to shut public sector unfunded schemes today, you have to bring the costs forward to the current generation of taxpayers and jack up their taxes. You going to vote for that?
I don't know, you could do, the alternative would be notional DC. So we have a notional defined benefit, an unfunded defined benefit at the moment. And the concept of defined contribution with no money in the pot already exists. You know, Sweden's state pension system is run on that basis, that you build up a DC pot, but there's no money there actually. You know, it's a pretend DC pot until you reach retirement, and then it becomes, you know, essentially a real DC pot, and then it's funded by taxes. So, you know, we could move to a DC world, but I think the public sector is still the most highly unionised, you know, part of the workforce, you know, by a mile. So I think, you know, there's a big fight for any government that wants to move in that direction.
Now, I imagine at both Aviva and Royal London, you've got blue sky thinking rooms where you all sit around on bean bags and come up with great ideas.
Oh no, we've been rumbled.
Playing on Rubik's cubes to spark the imagination. What's the to sum up and finish off for us now? What's the best single idea you think that's not been put into place out there, that if you could wave a magic wand in the pensions world?
I think drawdown solutions. I mean, drawdown is fairly young in the UK. We've only been around since 1997, and I think we really only got serious about it when freedom and choice came around. You know, I think there's a lot of science potentially to be applied to drawdown to make that drawdown pot last 35 or 40 years, however long our retirement's going to be. And I think that science will be the next big thing, the next big idea. Now, some people are beginning to talk about some of these ideas. Some of these ideas are quite well established in the US, but I think we can probably even do better than the what the US have at the moment, I think there's gains to be made in using science to manage drawdown.
Have you brought your pensions wand with you?
I think for me the most interesting final frontier, as it were, is between pensions and care.
Right.
We know the over 85s are the fastest growing section of the population. We know that, if you spend 2-3 years in a care home, you can face catastrophic care costs running into many, many tens of thousands. And how we do that, and my strong feeling is this, even before I worked for an insurance company, I think this is an insurance issue, not a savings issue. The idea that we would all save 100,000 quid just in case we're the unlucky 1 in 10 who face those sorts of bills doesn't seem credible to me. So how do you have a sort of insurance element for catastrophic long-term care costs? Is that a separate thing to the pensions? Do you integrate them in some way? Who do you sell the product to? I think that's a very fertile area for looking at.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. We're going to take a very, very quick break, and when we come back, we've got Tim Rees from Scottish Widows, Peter Bradshaw from Selector Pension, and we're going to get stuck into all things defined benefits and try and grasp that nettle of the transfer market. We'll see you back here very, very shortly. Thank you very much.